let me ask a question then. You can see on your note sheet that we are talking about Saul and Paul, or Saul or Paul. So here's a question, okay? I wasn't going to, and I'm not going to, put it in Mentimeter. So we're not going to actually poll it. I just kind of want to know, you guys answer for yourselves. You don't even have to raise your hand. But did Saul change his name to Paul? Did Saul, okay, and this is for those of you who have read through the Bible and are a little bit familiar with it. If you're not, that's fine. You shouldn't know the answer to this question. You know, it's like you guys asking me a question about the television show Blackish or something. I have no idea. But did Saul change his name to Paul? And I'm guessing most of you would probably say, yeah, changed his name. This is one of those things that a lot of times people will tell you that. I'm of the persuasion that I don't think that's actually what happened. I think Saul/Paul, which is why both his names are up there, had a Roman name because he was a Roman citizen, and a Jewish name because he was a Jewish person. And so he started out going by Saul because his main identity was in his Jewishness. But then when he became all things to all people, he moved and was referred to more often as Paul. Now, just so you know that I'm not totally making this up. If you have Acts, you can go to Acts. You got it now? You promise? All right. You're my heroes. Okay? I don't know. Let me look and see. Yes! That's it. Oh, okay. Way to go. You're my hero. I changed the wrong one. Anyway, if you go to Acts chapter 13, there's just one verse in here where we'll get an idea of what's going on. Okay? In the story of Acts, it's the story of how the church started. Saul originally doesn't like Christians. He doesn't like the people of the way who are saying that they are followers of Christ. And so he's persecuting the church and people who are doing that. And on his way, with letters in hand to say, hey, it's okay that you can persecute these people and put them in jail and all that kind of stuff. On his way to go do that in other places, he meets Jesus on this road to Damascus and has this, what we'd call a conversion experience. And Jesus says, okay, here's what I need you to do. Just go to this city, hang out, wait, and you will be told what to do. And somebody comes and tells him, and he ends up going through the rest of the book of Acts to all kinds of different places, having all kinds of adventures. And in Acts chapter 13, just look at verse 9. Okay? Paul and Barnabas are on their way. They're in Cyprus, and they're dealing with this magician. Okay, but we're not going to, you can read that story on your own, but I just want you to see verse 9. But Paul, or Saul, who was also called Paul. And a lot of times, and I'm just saying this because I think, guys, this is why it's important that we read Scripture for ourselves. Because I'm guessing most of you would say, yeah, God changed Saul's name to Paul. And I don't know if you can really make a biblical case for that. Saul was also called Paul. He had two names. Like, I have two names. I'm called Dad, and I'm called Jason. And some of you call me Pastor. Like, I have multiple names. Saul had multiple names. And so Saul, who was also called Paul, and you can go back in Acts chapter 26, he's standing before King Agrippa. He's in prison. All kinds of stuff has happened to him. And we'll get on into this in just a second. But I just want you to look. In Acts chapter 26, I don't think I even put this in your YouVersion, but I just want you to know this. So you maybe write this down. Acts chapter 26, in verse 14, Saul/Paul is telling his story of his conversion. And in verse 14 he says, And when we had fallen to the ground, I heard a voice saying to me in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's hard for you to kick against the goads. And he goes on and he keeps telling the story. And then around verse 24, and as he was saying these things in his defense, Festus, who's another guy that was listening, said with a loud voice, Paul, you're out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind. But Paul said, I'm not out of my mind, most excellent Festus. I'm speaking true and rational words. And he goes on and they just talk. But you can see like here in the same story, Paul's referring to himself as Saul. Everybody else is referring to him as Paul. Even he just got done saying, my name's Saul. Here's what happened. This is what I had said. They called me by Saul. And the guy turns around and says, Paul, you're out of your mind. So just keep in mind sometimes it's worth digging into. It's not always just what I say, and I don't want you to just trust what I say, which is why I would encourage you to bring your Bible, to look up not just the verses that we put in there in YouVersion, but read it for yourself. And if there's questions, if I get it wrong, if this doesn't make sense, on your connection card on the back, comments, critiques, questions, write those things down, and we want to try and address them before we leave here. Okay? If I made a mistake, I don't want you guys to believe that that's what I meant. I want to get a chance to correct it. And if I don't know the answer, maybe I too forcefully said, here's what I think, and you took it as, here's what it says, and I need to correct that. So write those things down. I want to be on the same page. So, with that said, we're going to look at Saul/Paul. And Paul, we're just going to call him Paul from now on. Paul wrote almost half of the New Testament. Okay, there's like 27 books. He wrote like 13 of them. And he goes from hating Christians to becoming one to making Christians. Now, we know that Jesus is the one who makes people into adopted members of the family of God. But Paul goes from hating those to becoming one to saying, hey, why don't you join the family? Okay, so it's kind of a huge transformation. And Acts, where it talks a lot about his travels and all the things that he did. He was beaten, and he was stoned, and he was whipped, and he was lashed, and he was shipwrecked, and he was hungry, and all this talks about all of that kind of stuff. But it doesn't tell us all of the stories of the things that happened to him. And so he wrote to different places. That's what these other letters in the New Testament are about. He wrote to Philippi or Ephesus or Corinth. He wrote to these places, and he usually wrote to correct or confront something that was going on in these churches or places where there were new believers, because Paul had been there, or he wrote to encourage them, because it's not easy being a believer in a time when people like Saul are trying to kill you, where the king doesn't like you and you get thrown in prison for it. And so he's writing to correct or to encourage. And so we get to Corinthians, and we're going to be in 2 Corinthians in just a little section of it. And in 2 Corinthians, one of the things he's dealing with is the false teachers who are coming and saying that you have to believe this, you have to behave this way, and they're minimizing Paul and his call from God. And he's addressing that in like chapter 10 through 12 in chapter 11. Okay? This is where we're going to be. I'm just going to read it to you. In chapter 11, start in verse 21, and we're just going to read to the end. Okay? So, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 21 on. To my shame, this is Paul writing, I must say, we were too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, and he says, I'm speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I'm better. I'm a better one. I'm talking like a madman, with far greater labors, with far more imprisonments, with countless beatings and often near death. 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes less 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, in toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food and cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there's the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak and I'm not weak? Who is made to fall and I am not indignant? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Artaxerxes was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, and I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. Okay, so you can see just from this little section, Paul has had a lot of adventures and a lot of hardship. And all of this happened after he became a believer, when he decided to actually do what God had told him to do. So Jesus has come and he says, believe in me. Saul says, anybody who believes in that guy is terrible. We're going to throw him in prison and persecute him. And then Jesus says, stop that, believe in me. And Paul goes, okay, I believe in you, and I'm going to go tell other people about it. And now he starts getting in trouble. Sometimes that might seem how our life is, because we try and make and do the right thing, and we find out that it leads to more problems. And it's not a fun situation to be in. And so what I want you to write down, and what I want you to get from what we're going to see from Paul here, is write down this part right here. Oh, actually, I want to show you a picture. Let's do that. She shouldn't be here, but we'll tell you about her, and I'll come back to her in a second. This is a friend of mine. Her name is Michelle Evanowski. And Michelle, when she was 18, was a wild child. Okay? And so she was out drinking with her friends. They were riding in the back of a pickup truck. They lived down in Florida. They were going on one of the on-ramps to a highway or something like that. And the person who was driving too fast and ended up flipping the truck. She was in the back. And so now that's what she looks like in her face. And this is what she's been like for the last 23 years. She cannot walk. She has usage of her hands, but they're not completely. I mean, she can drive her wheelchair, and she can write, and she's graduated college. She has a teaching degree. And so she's made the most of it, but some of the stupid decisions she made have caused her to suffer. And she suffered enormously. When we lived there, my wife would sometimes volunteer as a nurse to take care of her. And so she'd show up at 5:30 in the morning and use the transom. Is that what they call it? Yeah, kind of. I don't know. Whatever it is, the lift thing to get her out of bed. And, huh? Hoyer thing. Okay. I mean, you guys know. I don't. Somebody shouted out. And the lift thingy. Yes, that's the technical term for non-medical people. And get her out and get her showered and get her in, just have to take care of her, have to clean her and bathe her, and all things that she could not do for herself. Now, I don't know about you, and I think about this with my wife working hospice, like when it gets to the point where you can't take care of yourself, you got to be, at least I'm going to be embarrassed. I'm like, I just am. I don't have to get into details. And I can only imagine what it's like to not be able to do things for yourself. But it's kind of the consequences of some of the bad choices that she'd made. But with Paul, it's different. He's getting beaten and whipped and shipwrecked and starving and hungry and all attacked because he's trying to tell people how much Jesus loves them. And so, I guess let's just say this. You don't have to sin in order to suffer. You don't have to sin in order to suffer. Now, a lot of us know this, and sometimes we think, well, you're right, I didn't sin. And we don't recognize our own sin. But let me just explain something. Sometimes you will suffer more for doing what's right than you would have for living out what's wrong. And that's not always the most comforting thing. I mean, if that's the call of Jesus, hey, let me suffer more for doing what's right, it's no wonder some people say no. Just this last week, a court case came down, and there was a football coach who had been praying with his team. And he got sued and was told, you cannot pray in that capacity. And so, who knows what he's going to do. But we do know this, that if we do wrong, if we live wrong, that our sin can cause suffering, like my friend Michelle. The choices that we make to betray trust, to overstep bounds, to steal, to lie, to cheat, to do things against our employers, our spouses, or our kids, our parents, or anything like that, they can cause consequences. Maybe not as drastic as being a quadriplegic practically, but you might lose friends, you might lose trust, you might lose your reputation, but you don't have to sin in order to suffer. You can sin and cause suffering. But understand this, it doesn't matter what end of the spectrum you're on. If you're somebody who is kind of one of the, I try to do the right thing because I want to do the right thing, and you don't usually do the wrong thing, you're just good. What in the world happened? I'm not touching it. Back up, buddy. Here, see, you don't have to sin to suffer. Okay? That wasn't even my illustration, but hey, it works.
Hashtag first world problem.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I don't even know where I am in my notes here. Yeah, we already made it. So you guys got your blank at least, right? There's Michelle. You saw what she is. You don't have to sin to suffer. And if this happens again, Ralph, maybe you can take control back there. I'll just look at my notes when I can. So you guys got the part where either way, Jesus is worth it? Did you guys get that? It doesn't matter if you've messed it up yourself and you're suffering because of that. Because I don't know if you noticed Michelle's shirt. But between her and her husband, she's all about Jesus. Some of you have heard of Joni Eareckson Tada, diving accident almost 50 years ago now. Same thing. Speaks to crowds telling them about Jesus. Either way, Jesus is worth it. So we're going to look at Paul and all the things that he went through for just a few minutes here and see if maybe you can find yourself. You're feeling beat up, you're feeling left out, you're feeling whatever. Maybe it's no fault of your own, maybe it's completely your fault. But whatever it is, Jesus is worth it. And so let's see what we can learn. All right. So we're going to start with just the first part here. Verses 21, 22, and 23. Okay, good. It's showing up. So Paul writes this. To my shame, I must say we're too weak for that. And you can go back and kind of read the context. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, and then he says, I'm speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast of that. So whatever, it's kind of like, you ever seen little kids, like my dad can beat up your dad, and then they go back and forth? You know, the one says, well, my dad can lift 100 pounds. He's like, my dad can too. And then they go, well, my dad can lift 200 pounds, and I can too. You know, or whatever it is. That's kind of what Paul's saying this conversation is like. Whatever they boast about, I'm going to boast about it too. I'm talking like a fool. I also dare to boast about that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offsprings of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? Then he ups the game. I'm better. You know, this is like, I'm strong, I'm stronger. I'm smart, I'm smarter. And he says, okay, he's gone from fool to now I'm talking like a madman. He says, with far greater labors and far more imprisonments and countless beatings and often near death. And so we look, and Paul might be writing to confront false teachers. And that's kind of what he's talking to, or that's what he's addressing here. But what he's saying here to the Corinthians is that comparison is foolish. Comparison is foolish. So, how many times, and a lot of times we don't say this, but we think it, okay? You may have done it when you came here today. And you look around and you see either what time people showed up, what people are wearing, if people are taking notes, if somebody's sleeping, if somebody's not, and you're like, oh, me too. I don't get it, me either. And we just kind of compare. That's foolish. But then when the game gets upped to like, it's just madness, is when we start thinking, oh, I'm better. Comparison is foolish. If you think you're better, that's ridiculous. If you think you're just as good, that's ridiculous because that's not the standard. So I remember having conversations like this when I was in school. When I was in college, you'd take one of those really hard classes where the professor curved it. And you'd compare afterwards. How'd you do? I think I told you guys about my anthropology class. It was one of my, it wasn't a favorite class. It was an easy class. Why? Because you could get a 50 and then go figure out what you got wrong and go talk to the professor, and he'd give you whatever you got right when you went and talked to him. So we all did really well. But I remember after one of those tests, I had no idea what culture he's taught. I don't even know what continent we're on. Like, I swear we talked about this, but I don't recognize any of these words or peoples or whatever. And so we get done, and I'm comparing with one of my friends. He's like, how'd you do? He goes, got a 55. Another friend of mine goes, me too. Oh, well, that should be good, right? I mean, if you're comparing, at least you guys are both failures. And I'm sitting over there going, I'm better, because I got a 65. But you guys see the ridiculousness of this? Because when we compare ourselves to one another, I'm the same, me too, or I'm better, we're totally missing the standard. The standard isn't 55 or 65. The standard is 100, and that's set by Jesus. And way too often, we look at other people and go, well, I would never do that. I'm not as bad as that guy. I don't think that way. Well, at least I didn't mess up like you did. There's nothing grace about that. It's just foolishness. And so Paul is explaining, here's these guys boasting about who they are and what they do. That's foolishness. Because he understands that he's been called by Jesus. And like we said, either way, whether you've compared yourself to other people or whether you're pretty good about that, saying, I'm just a man, or I'm just a woman, Jesus is worth it. Either way. And so, when we look at Jesus, my just an encouragement to you, what I think Paul is saying here is like, are they a Jew? I'm a Jew. Are they Israelite? I'm an Israelite. Are they son of Abraham? I am too. Are they a servant of Christ? I'm better. He's saying, do you see how stupid this is? It's not about each other. It's about something different. And I think it's about this. It's about faithfulness. And faithfulness is what's worth it. When we are faithful to Jesus, when we are faithful to what God has called us to do, even when it looks different than what God has called someone else to do, when we're faithful to that, that's when we can get an attaboy. That's when we get a way to go. That's when we look at Paul and go, man, how did he do this? Well, because he was faithful. And faithfulness matters. I think you guys understand this, but, if you're sitting with your spouse, you might want to, just kind of look over at him and go, hey, does faithfulness matter? I mean, it matters in middle school. When those little kids start dating. It's like, oh my word, I can't believe I saw him with her. He's not being faithful. I can't believe he was talking to her. Faithfulness matters, but here's the thing with it. Faithfulness is an individual sport. Faithfulness is one of those things where your response is your responsibility. Faithfulness isn't something that you compare with somebody else. It's something that is, did you meet the standard? Were you faithful or were you not? It's kind of a yes or no. It's not who was more. And so look at what Paul wrote in another book in Galatians chapter 6. I think I put this one in your notes. In Galatians chapter 6, let's see. Is it Galatians 6? 6, 4, and 5. Yeah, that's not the one I'm looking for. I gave you the wrong note. I'm failing, man. But you know what? It's okay. Either way, Jesus is worth it. Yeah, you guys, some of you will know this verse. I don't know why I have this there, and I'm blanking on it right now. But it's when Paul is talking, and he says, let each one test his own work, and then his reason to boast will be in himself alone, and not in his neighbor. For each will have to bear his own load.
Jason, that's what Galatians 6, 4, and 5 says.
Is it?
Yeah.
Maybe I was looking in the wrong book. I was looking at Ephesians. I'm trying to read it. I'm like, why is this talking about fathers? Do not provoke your children. I'm like, that's not it. I know that verse. Okay. So,
Warning for your afternoon.
yes. Wow. I'm so thankful for grace. So Paul is writing. And the context of chapter 6, this is why I'm so confused, because I thought I was reading it, and I'm like, that's not what it's about, but I swear that's what it's about. Because chapter 6, he's talking about somebody who screws up. And I haven't put the rest of the verses in your notes, but you might want to look this up, because here's what it says starting in verse 1. Brothers, if anyone is caught in a transgression, if anyone's not faithful, if anyone fails, you who are spiritual should restore him in a spirit of gentleness and keep watch on yourselves lest you be tempted. Bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if anyone thinks he's something when he's nothing, he deceives himself. In other words, this comparison with other people, you think you're something, you're nothing. And then he says, verse 4, let each one test his own work. And then his reason to boast will be in himself, alone, and not in his neighbor. For each one will bear his own load. So the important thing to understand here, guys, is comparison is foolish. Paul understands it. He's making that point. But faithfulness is worth it because Jesus is worth it. We can go on to the next few verses here. And what he says in verse 24, and 25, 6, and 7. He gives this list. He says, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews, 40 lashes less one. Now, we won't go into a whole lot of detail, but basically that was kind of like the Jewish law. Like you can beat somebody up to 39 times, and if they die in those 39, it's okay. But if you give them one more and then they die, not okay. Okay, so 5 times he received 40 lashes less one. 3 times he was beaten with rods. Once he was stoned. 3 times he was shipwrecked. And he just goes on, like, we don't even read about that many things happening in Acts. We read about a shipwreck, but not the other. Like, where in the world did these things come from? We just don't know. We know that he was stoned. I can't remember what chapter that is. But we know that he was stoned, dragged out of the city, and left for dead. But all these things, and he just goes listing. Danger here, danger there, danger. Wow. How could he keep going on? Because how many of us can relate to maybe not what happened to him, but we know that the things that happen, what happens around us, it's hard. Like, we're sitting here right now in air conditioning with power and it's 84 degrees out, and 1,100 miles away down in the coast of Texas, there are people who have no place to sit. And even if they did, they couldn't sit because it's flooded with water because of Hurricane Harvey. It's not fair. Things are hard. And what happens around us is hard. And we don't have to go all the way there. We can go here. What happens around us, like, it's not the end of the world, but poor little Greenville North State team, they lost yesterday. That's a bummer. And if you ever watch the Little League World Series, they're playing right now in the consolation game. But if you ever watch any of that, it's great to watch the sportsmanship, but it's also like one of those. I was watching the team from, I don't remember, I think last year they said it, and it was Maine, and they were interviewing him, and they'd won. And they were just talking about it, and they'd beaten the Korean team, and the Korean guys were talking about how sad they were through a translator. And I'm sitting there, and my kids call me the Grim Weeper, and I'm just sitting there by myself upstairs, and I'm watching them. There's these, 12, 13, 14-year-old kids who have, they made a mistake, or they threw a pitch that led to a home run, or they threw a pass ball, or made an errant throw or something. They're just like, it was my fault. I wish I could have it back. And they're upset. Like, what happens around us is hard. And people sitting next to you are going through stuff that you might have no idea about, and it's hard. And unless Paul wrote these things down and we knew what he went through, we'd only know half of it. And even this, there's probably more. What happens around us is hard. But the reason Paul went through this is because he understood that Jesus is worth it. The reason Paul did all of this is because he understood that obedience is worth it. He was set apart, he and Barnabas, set apart to go and bring the gospel to people, which is exactly what he was doing when he was shipwrecked. It's exactly what he was doing when he was whipped. It's exactly what he was doing when he was struck with rods. It's exactly what he was doing. It's what he was doing. And so you don't have to sin to suffer. He's not sinning, but he's suffering. But Jesus is worth it. Why? Because obedience is worth it. I read this story. It's about a guy named, I don't know French, but his name is Pierre Barlot. And he was a gunner in the fort of Mont Velerin during the Prussian siege of Paris. And he was standing by his gun when General Noel, the commander, came up, and he leveled his glass at the, I don't even know how to say this, Sèvres Bridge. Okay? And the general looked at him and he said, "Gunner, do you see that bridge over there?" And the gunner said, "Yes, sir." And that little shanty in the thicket of shrubs over to the left, he goes, "I see it, sir," said Pierre, turning pale. "It's a nest of Prussians. Try it with a shell, my man." And so Pierre turned paler still. He sighted his piece deliberately, carefully, and fired it. "Well hit, my man, well hit." But the general, when he looked at Pierre, was surprised to see a tear running down his cheek. He said, "What's the matter, man?" He said, "Pardon me, General. It was my house. Everything I had in the world." And I wish I could tell you that Paris was defended. This story actually doesn't end well. Paris actually fell. So he blew up his house and they lost. But he was obedient in an effort to do the right thing. And obedience for us, we don't lose. Like, this war has already been won. Jesus has already conquered the kingdom of darkness. He's defeated death. He set us free to live a new life in Christ. This is the good news. And so obedience is worth it, even when what happens around us is hard. So that's why Paul was willing to suffer all of these things, because he understood that Jesus was worth it, and because Jesus is worth it, it made obedience worth it. So these next verses a lot of times get lumped in together, but I understand these next couple of verses, 28 and 29, more from experience. And so in 28 and 29, here's what it says. "And apart from the other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches." And Paul is saying, who is weak? And I'm not weak. In other words, I feel what you feel. Who is made to fall? And I'm not indignant. Paul understands something. It's not just what happens around us that's hard. It's not just these things that are hard. There was some inner turmoil happening in him. And he was under stress, feeling a burden, had anxiety for all of these churches and the people and what was going on in them and what they were having to endure and suffer. He was okay doing what he had to do because he understood Jesus is worth it and obedience is worth it. But he also understood something else. And maybe you understand this too. What happens within us is actually the hardest. What happens around us is hard, but what happens within us is actually the hardest. See, because Paul is actually listing out the things that happened around him is like, hey, look at all the things that I've endured. All this stuff has happened. As a matter of fact, all of this bad stuff is what makes me a good guy. But when he gets to 28 and 29, apart from the other things, there is this daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Anxiety isn't exactly a fruit of the Spirit. It's not a rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. It's one of those things that we're supposed to cast our cares, our anxieties on Him because He cares for us. And Paul's saying, I'm having a hard time doing that. What goes on around me is hard, but what goes on within me is hardest. And the reason I said I understand this is because I also, and my family to a degree as well, and anybody in ministry, I've talked to so many pastors. Jason Lineberger, who is pastor of Ignite, we meet in his building, I talk with him. Same thing. Doesn't matter whether we're this size or their size. We face a daily pressure and an anxiety for our churches that God has put us in charge of. And so when one of you are weak, we feel weak with you. We feel it. And when one of you fall or fail, we feel that too. We become indignant. We can't just sit by and watch you destroy your life. And so we treat you like our family. And so for me, this isn't a job. Yes, I get paid. Hopefully for a little while longer. But you are my family, which is what makes it so hard when you guys are stupid. And it's what makes it so hard when you guys are hurting. And it's what makes it so hard when you guys push away. It's not because I don't care. It's because of how much I do care. And you'll never have any idea. I don't expect you to have any idea. And I'm not here to scold anybody or anything like that. You will never understand. As close as it'll come is if you have kids and you want what's best for them and you watch them make not the best choices. you'll get an idea of what it's like. And then multiply that by 16 and counting times however many of you there are. I've always said that the privilege of ministry is to be invited into people's pain. Paul understood that, but it's not easy. I wouldn't want it any other way. And maybe you understand it too. Maybe you understand that what happens within you is hard because you look at yourself and you're like, man, I'm a failure, because you've played the comparison game and you think, I'll never be that good, I'll never get it right, I'll never conquer this sin, I'll never be able to rectify that wrong. And you have these thoughts go on in your mind, and all the things that are going on around you, sticks and stones can break my bones, and people are making fun of you, and that's fine. And you put on a good front. But the things that go on inside of you are killing you. The way that you think about yourself. You face a daily pressure. You have anxiety. Why do I keep on doing this? Why did Paul keep on doing this? He had this anxiety, and he didn't just end here. He went on and continued to other churches, started other churches. And so if he had a daily pressure for the churches, at one point, it's just like blowing up the balloon. He has a bigger pressure now because there are more churches. Why would he keep doing that? I think he understood something that I've given my life to, and it's that community is worth it. The churches that he was concerned about, apart from other things, there is a daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. And he starts saying, if anybody is weak, man, I'm weak. If anybody messes up and they're made to fall, it makes me angry. But I don't want them to do it alone. They shouldn't do it alone. And I think if Paul were to write it this way, he'd probably say, you can't do it alone. And so if you're on the outside edges and fringes of community, like, I'm happy to be friends. You can come over to my house. We have people there all the time. It looks like a parking lot. I could sell cars. Might sell yours. Because that's just what it looks like at my house. But it's because I love people. But if you're on kind of the outsides and you're feeling disconnected, it's hard. I understand that. What happens outside is hard. What happens around us is hard. Maybe you're not a people person. But community is worth it. And it might be hard for you. You need to press into it. You might think nobody will like me. I don't know what to say. You have all these thoughts of things that go back from when you were in middle school, high school, made fun of, or whatever. That's harder. I understand that. But community is worth it. And we know this because Jesus came to be part of our community so that he could bring us into community with him. And Jesus is worth it. So if you're suffering, you don't have to sin to suffer. I'm not saying that you're sinning because you are feeling lonely. But I bet you're suffering. You don't need to. Jesus is worth it. So obedience is worth it. Faithfulness is worth it. And community is worth it. You're not meant to do life alone. And just, guys, remember, church isn't a place that you go. It's a people that you are. Okay? Church is not a place that you go. You're still my family. Well, if we're here on Sunday morning, or if we're meeting having tacos at Taco Tuesday, or if I run into you somewhere else. And if I run into somewhere else and you're acting stupid, I'll probably tell you, quit acting stupid. And I got some of you guys around here are good enough friends to tell me the same thing. Chase, cut it out. You're a jerk. Like, it's not easy, but it's right. Obedience is worth it. And you get to the end here. Verse 30. If I must boast, I will boast of all the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who is blessed forever, knows that I'm not lying. At Damascus, the governor, under King Aretas, was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall. Okay, can you imagine, like, I am the mighty Paul. Or I'm Saul. I mean, either way, he's a respected dude in the Jewish community, and he's a Roman citizen. Like, I mean, he got permission to go and put people in prison. So he's like, kind of up there. And he's cowering in a basket as they lower him out the wall. You're an amazing man there, Paul. You go on and he starts talking in chapter 12 about a vision that he had and Then about how God had given them this thorn in his side, and he prayed and asked the Lord to take it away, and the Lord didn't. And then we get to verse 9 and 10. But the Lord said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly of my weakness, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, calamities. For when I'm weak, then I am strong. See, the thing we need to understand, you can say it however you want. This is just how I'm going to say it. My weakness, my inability, my failures, they show his power. The fact that somebody like me can speak, or like Ralph or Josh or anybody else can get up and presume to speak the truth and the hope of Jesus is ridiculous. I'm not qualified. I'm not holy. I'm not righteous. And for some reason, God has used me in my own family and with some of you and other people that I know that are spread around this world. It's not me. It is not me. I can't do it. It's my weakness that shows his power. It was interesting. We watched on Friday night. We have Friday movie night. We watched a movie. Any of you ever seen Doctor Strange? It's a comic movie. Okay, it was really good. I didn't even know it was out. I just found it. It was rated pretty good on IMDb. I'm like, this seems pretty decent, and it's not rated R. All right. And but it's got so many like spiritual gospel parallels. So cool. This doctor damages his hands. He's a neurosurgeon, and he's seeking to figure out how he can get his power back. And he thinks his power is his ability to just save lives and do neurosurgery. He's just this cocky doctor. But he can't do it anymore. And he goes to pursue some knowledge and tap into this power source. And so while he's trying to learn this and the potential that there is, and it's really a pretty incredible movie, I thought. There's this one part in the line, or in the movie, where the person who's teaching him is trying to help him understand, you don't know Jack. You don't know Jack. And he's trying to figure out how to control Jack. You don't know anything. You don't understand this power. And he's going, I want to control the power. And they have this interchange. And so Dr. Strange says, I control it by surrendering control? That doesn't make any sense. And the person who's teaching him says, not everything does. Not everything has to. And I'm looking at that. That part just totally stuck out for me, because how many times do we want to understand the why behind the suffering, the why behind I can't get this right, the why behind I need to obey, the why behind any of these things that are difficult for us to do. We want to understand, and we don't. And guess what? You don't have to, because the strength and this power comes from surrendering control, and that doesn't make any sense, but that's how it works. In my weakness, you are made strong. Strength makes sense, but guess what? It's not your strength. It's the strength that Jesus gives us. And so at the end of the day, trust is worth it. Jesus is worth it. Faithfulness is worth it. Obedience is worth it. Community is worth it. But all that really matters is, have we trusted Jesus to do what he said he was going to do? Have we trusted that he has done what he said he did? In other words, your sins have been paid for. You have been set free. You do not have to sulk and sit in shame and guilt anymore. You don't have to live there. You messed up maybe this morning, maybe 1,000,000 times, maybe last night. I don't know. You did a big sin. You did a little sin. But remember, comparison doesn't matter. It's foolish. Jesus came to take that away. Do you trust him? Jesus says that you have been given power and authority to represent him in this world. Do you trust him that you actually have that? That you're more than a conqueror? I think Jesus would say the same thing to Paul. Trust is worth it. Thank you for trusting me. Well done. Way to go. He says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Just think about that. Just in your own time, sometime this week, just take that verse and dwell on those little parts. Okay, there's just 6 pieces there. My grace. Whose grace? It's not your grace, it's his grace. He gives abundantly, more than you deserve. My grace. And it's sufficient. It means it's enough. It doesn't mean that it's going to come. You're not coming up lacking. It's sufficient. Jesus' grace is sufficient. It's more than enough for whatever it is that you're struggling with. For you. For you. This is about you. Jesus loves you. My grace is sufficient for you. And my power, not your power, Jesus' power. My power. And it's made perfect. Jesus' power is perfect in weakness. Think about that for a second. You can screw up Jesus' power by thinking that you're strong. You can make the perfect power of Jesus imperfect by trying to do it yourself. So let's not do that. Whatever you've done, whether you're doing it right and you're suffering because of doing the right thing, or you've screwed it up royally and you're suffering because of doing the wrong thing, it's never too late to look to Jesus, and Jesus is worth it.